The spring auction yard smelled of mud and desperation. Jacob Brennan stood at the edge of the crowd, his hat pulled low, watching men bid on livestock and equipment with the casual cruelty of those who'd never known want. He hadn't come to buy anything. He'd come because something in the air felt wrong, the way it did before a storm rolled over the plains. When they brought the girl out, his stomach turned to stone. She couldn't have been more than 17, maybe 18. Her dress hung loose on a frame too thin, and her dark hair fell in tangles past her shoulders. She kept her eyes on the ground, but Jacob could see her hands trembling at her sides. The auctioneer, a fat man named Carver with a voice like gravel, rattled off terms that made Jacob's jaw clench. Debt settlement. Sheriff's property. Legal proceedings completed. Now then, Carver called out, who'll start the bidding for this fine young woman? Strong enough for work, young enough to train proper. Starting at $20. Jacob felt something break inside his chest. He'd seen auctions before, seen desperate people sold off to settle debts, but this was different. This was the sheriff's daughter. Everyone in Hollowbrook knew Margaret Hayes. Knew her mama had died 2 winters back. Knew the sheriff had taken to drink after that, gambling away everything they had. But to see her standing there, about to be sold off like a mule, something in Jacob couldn't abide it. 20, someone called. An older rancher Jacob didn't recognize. 25, another voice. This one Jacob knew. Silas Morton, who owned the saloon and half the buildings on Main Street. Morton had dead eyes and a reputation for cruelty that kept folks from crossing him. Jacob's hands curled into fists. He'd come west to leave violence behind, to find honest work and a quiet life. He'd built a small homestead 15 miles outside town, worked his land alone, kept to himself. The past 3 years had been about putting distance between who he'd been and who he wanted to become. But standing there, watching Margaret Hayes try to make herself smaller as the bids climbed, he felt that old part of himself stir. $50, he said, his voice cutting through the crowd. Heads turned. Jacob stepped forward, meeting Carver's surprised gaze. Morton turned too, his eyes narrowing. "Well now," Carver said, recovering quickly. 50 from the gentleman in the back. "Do I hear 55? 60, Morton said, not looking away from Jacob. 75, Jacob countered. A murmur rippled through the crowd. That was good money, more than most men carried at once. Morton's jaw worked, and Jacob could see him calculating, weighing whether this girl was worth making a point. 100, Morton said flatly. Jacob had $137 to his name. It was everything he'd saved from 3 years of hard work, every penny he'd set aside for seed and supplies and the lumber he needed to finish his barn. Spending it all on a stranger went against every practical bone in his body. But he'd seen enough evil in his life to know what would happen if Morton won this bid. 125, Jacob said. The crowd went silent. Even Carver looked taken aback. Morton's face darkened, but after a long moment he turned away with a dismissive wave. Jacob felt no satisfaction in the victory, only a hollow sense of dread at what he'd just done. Sold. Carver's gavel cracked down. 125 to the gentleman. Come settle up, friend. Jacob paid in cash, counting out bills and coins until his pockets were nearly empty. Carver handed him a paper that made his skin crawl just to touch it. A bill of sale, like she was property. The man leaned close as Jacob folded it away. "You know whose daughter that is?" Carver asked quietly. "I know. Sheriff Hayes won't take kindly to this. He wanted Morton to buy her. Had an arrangement." Jacob looked at him. "Then the sheriff's got worse problems than me." He walked over to where Margaret stood, still staring at the ground. Up close, he could see the bruises on her wrists, fading yellow-green. Could see how she held herself like something broken that had been badly set. "Miss Hayes," he said gently. "My name's Jacob Brennan. I got a homestead about 3 hours' ride from here. It ain't much, but it's honest land and you'll be safe there. I'm gonna take you away from this place now, if that's all right with you." She looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and held a wariness that made Jacob's chest ache. She studied his face for a long moment, and he let her look, let her see whatever she needed to see. "Why?" she whispered. "Because what they were doing here ain't right," he said simply. "And because nobody deserves to be treated like property. You understand? I'm not buying you. I'm paying for your freedom. What you do with it is your own business." Something flickered in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the first small seed of hope. She nodded once, a tiny movement. "All right then," Jacob said. He took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame. "Let's go home." The ride back to his homestead took longer than usual because Jacob kept his horse to a steady walk, conscious of Margaret riding behind him. She hadn't said a word since they left town, and he didn't push her. The spring sun was warm on their backs, and the prairie stretched out in all directions, green and gold and endless. His property sat in a shallow valley between two low hills, sheltered from the worst winds. The cabin was small but solid, built from logs he'd cut himself. The barn stood half-finished beside it, and beyond that his fields lay ready for planting. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it was honest. Jacob helped Margaret down from the horse, noting how she flinched when his hands touched her waist. He stepped back quickly, giving her space. "Cabin's yours," he said, gesturing. "I'll bed down in the barn until we figure something better. There's a root cellar out back with potatoes and some dried meat. Help yourself to whatever you need." She stared at the cabin, then back at him. "I don't understand." "What's to understand? You need a place to stay. I got one. Seems simple enough to me." "But you paid—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "You paid all that money." Jacob looked at her steadily. "I paid money to keep you out of Morton's hands. That's the beginning and end of it. You don't owe me nothing, Miss Hayes. You want to leave tomorrow, head wherever you like, I won't stop you. But if you want to stay a while, catch your breath, you're welcome to. This is just a place where you can be safe. Nothing more." Tears welled in her eyes. She brushed them away quickly, angry at herself for showing weakness. "I got nowhere else to go." "Then you'll stay," Jacob said simply. "Now come on. Let me show you around before the light fails." The cabin was sparse inside. One room with a fireplace, a bed Jacob had built himself, a rough table and 2 chairs. Shelves held his few possessions, some books, dishes, a photograph of his parents that he kept wrapped in cloth. Margaret stood in the doorway, taking it all in. "It ain't fancy," Jacob said, suddenly aware of how bare it must look to her. "But it's warm and the roof don't leak." "It's fine," she said softly. Then, after a pause, "Where will you really sleep?" "Barn's got a loft with clean straw. I've slept in worse places, I promise you." He saw her about to protest and held up a hand. "Miss Hayes, I grew up sleeping on dirt floors. Straw in a barn is luxury. Don't trouble yourself over it." He left her there and went to tend his horse, unsaddling the animal and brushing him down with steady, practiced movements. The work calmed him, gave his hands something to do while his mind raced. He'd just spent everything he had on a girl he didn't know. The whole town would be talking by now. The sheriff would come looking eventually. Morton certainly would. Jacob had wanted peace, but peace was a luxury for men whose consciences were clean. He looked back at the cabin, saw the flicker of lamplight through the window. Whatever happened next, he'd made his choice at that auction yard. No point in second-guessing it now. When he returned to the cabin an hour later, he found Margaret sitting at the table with the ledger he used for tracking supplies. She looked up, startled. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I wasn't snooping. I used to help Papa with his books before. I saw this and I thought maybe I could." She trailed off, closing the ledger carefully. "It's all right," Jacob said. "I ain't got nothing to hide. That's just where I keep track of seeds and feed, what I spend and what I bring in. Not that I bring in much yet. This is only my third planting season." She opened the ledger again, ran her finger down the columns. Her handwriting had been elegant once, he could see that. Now her hands shook slightly. "Your numbers are off," she said hesitantly. "Here and here. You're not accounting for the full cost of the seed." Jacob leaned over, saw where she was pointing. She was right. He'd been so focused on the immediate expenses that he'd missed the bigger picture. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "I've been short-changing myself for months." "I could fix it," Margaret offered quietly. "If you want. I'm good with figures." Jacob pulled out the other chair and sat down. "Miss Hayes, if you want to help with the books, I'd be grateful. But I don't want you thinking you got to earn your keep. You understand me? You're not here as hired help." She looked at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something other than fear in her eyes. "What am I here as, then?" "As someone who needed help," Jacob said simply. "And maybe, eventually, as a friend. If that's something you'd want." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My name is Margaret. But my mama used to call me Maggie." "Maggie?" Jacob repeated, and she nodded. "Well, Maggie, I'm pleased to make your proper acquaintance. And I'm grateful for the help with those books, because clearly I've been making a mess of them." The ghost of a smile touched her lips. It disappeared quickly, but it had been there. Jacob counted that as a victory. They worked together for another hour, Maggie correcting his figures and reorganizing his accounts with quick, sure movements. Jacob made coffee and cut thick slices of bread he'd baked 2 days before. They ate in companionable silence as the last light faded from the windows. "I should let you rest," Jacob said finally, standing. "Sun comes up early out here, and there's always work to be done. You need anything in the night, I'll be in the barn." "Mr. Brennan," Maggie said as he reached the door. He turned back. She was looking at the table, not at him. "Thank you. For what you did today. I know it cost you everything." "It was the right thing," Jacob said. "That's all that matters." He left before she could see the doubt in his eyes. The next few days established a rhythm. Jacob rose before dawn to tend the animals and work the fields. Maggie kept to the cabin mostly, but he'd catch her watching from the window sometimes. On the third day, he came in at noon to find her sweeping the floor, and the next morning there was fresh bread cooling on the table. She didn't say anything about it, and neither did he. On Sunday, Jacob went to town for supplies. He'd put it off as long as he could, but he needed seed for the south field and nails for the barn. The moment he rode into Hollowbrook, he felt eyes on him. The general store was quiet when he entered. Too quiet. The owner, a nervous man named Patterson, looked up from behind the counter and quickly looked away. Jacob gathered what he needed and brought it to the front. "That'll be $8, Patterson said, not meeting his eyes. Jacob counted out coins. "Everything all right, Patterson?" The man licked his lips. "Look, Brennan, I don't want no trouble." "Neither do I." "Then maybe you should think about bringing that girl back. Folks are saying—" "I don't care what folks are saying," Jacob said quietly. "You know what would have happened to her if I hadn't stepped in?" Patterson looked miserable. "Sheriff's been by 3 times this week. He's madder than a hornet. And Morton—" He stopped, shook his head. Just watch yourself, is all I'm saying." Jacob took his supplies and left. Outside, he nearly walked straight into Sheriff Hayes. The man had aged 10 years since Jacob had last seen him. His face was bloated and red, his eyes bloodshot. He smelled of whiskey even at noon. But his hand rested on his pistol, and his voice was hard. "Brennan." "Sheriff, I want my daughter back." Jacob kept his voice level. "Your daughter's a free woman. She can go where she pleases. She's my property until she's 21. That's the law." "No, sir," Jacob said. "That's not the law. That's you twisting the law because you gambled away everything she had and needed someone to pay your debts." Hayes' face darkened. "You got no right. I got every right. I paid fair price at a legal auction. You got a problem with that. Take it up with Judge Morrison." "Morrison's in Santa Fe for the month," Hayes said, and something in his smile made Jacob's blood run cold. "Lot can happen in a month, Brennan. You're new here. Don't know how things work. But you're about to learn." He walked away, and Jacob stood there, heart pounding. This was worse than he'd thought. Without the judge in town, Hayes and his friends could do whatever they wanted. Jacob was alone out at his homestead, 3 hours from help, and he'd just made enemies of the most powerful men in the county. He rode home faster than he should have, his mind racing. The sun was low when he reached his property, and he saw immediately that something was wrong. The barn door hung open, swinging in the wind. His horse whinnied from the corral, agitated. Jacob dismounted and pulled the rifle from his saddle. He moved quietly toward the cabin, every sense alert. The front door was closed, but he could see lamplight through the cracks. "Maggie?" he called softly. No answer. He kicked the door open and swept the room with his rifle. Empty. But things were overturned, the table, one of the chairs. His books lay scattered across the floor. And on the table, held down by a knife, was a note written in crude letters, "Bring her back or burn." Jacob's chest tightened. "Maggie!" he called louder, running back outside. "Maggie, I'm here." Her voice came from behind the cabin. He found her crouched in the root cellar, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her eyes were wide with terror. "Are you hurt?" Jacob asked, climbing down to her. "Did they touch you?" She shook her head. "I heard horses. 3 men. I ran and hid like you told me to. They searched the cabin, but they didn't find me." "Good girl," Jacob said. "You did exactly right." He helped her up, noting how she trembled. "Come on. Let's get you inside." They walked back to the cabin together. Jacob righted the furniture and picked up his scattered belongings while Maggie watched from the corner, her arms wrapped tight around herself. "They're going to keep coming," she said quietly. "Aren't they?" Jacob looked at the note on his table, at the knife driven through it. "Yeah, they are." "Then I should go. I'll leave tonight. Head north, or maybe—" "No." Jacob turned to face her. "You're not going anywhere. This is your home now, if you want it. And nobody's gonna drive you away from it." "But you heard what I said. They'll keep coming. They'll hurt you, maybe kill you. All because of me." "They'll try," Jacob said. "But I've dealt with worse men than Hayes and Morton. And I didn't save you from that auction just to let them drag you back. We're in this now, Maggie. Both of us. And we're gonna see it through." She stared at him. "Why? Why would you risk everything for me? You don't even know me." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "When I was 19, he said finally, "I watched men do terrible things during the war. Saw people treated like they didn't matter, like their lives were worth less than livestock. I did some of those terrible things myself. When the war ended, I came west to get away from all that. to be someone different. But if I'd walked away from that auction, if I'd let Morton take you, then I would have been just as bad as all those men I was trying to leave behind. You understand? This ain't about you owing me. This is about me being the kind of man who can sleep at night." Maggie's eyes glistened with tears. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Me too," Jacob admitted. "But we're gonna be smart about this. We're gonna prepare, and we're gonna be ready for whatever comes. And we're not gonna be alone." "What do you mean?" "I mean there's good people in this territory, people who don't hold with what Hayes and Morton are doing. We just gotta find them and make our case. The judge'll be back in a month. We just gotta last until then." She nodded slowly. "All right. I'll stay. But Jacob," she used his first name for the first time, "I won't let them hurt you because of me. If it comes to that, I'll go willingly. I won't have your blood on my hands." "Won't come to that," Jacob said, with more confidence than he felt. "Now come on. Let's bar the doors and get some rest. Tomorrow we start making this place defensible." That night, Jacob didn't go to the barn. He sat in a chair by the door with his rifle across his knees, listening to every sound the prairie made. Maggie lay in the bed, pretending to sleep. Neither of them spoke, but there was something in the shared silence that felt like a promise. They were in this together now, come what may. As dawn broke over the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jacob finally allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, Maggie was standing by the stove, making coffee. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and without words they both understood. This was just the beginning. The real fight was still to come. But for now they had this moment. This quiet morning. This fragile peace. And Jacob Brennan, who'd spent 3 years trying to outrun his past, realized that maybe he'd finally found something worth fighting for. The summer came on fierce and hot. Jacob worked the fields from dawn until the sun rode too high to bear, then retreated to the barn to work on finishing the structure that would shelter his animals through the next winter. Maggie kept the cabin, and slowly, carefully, she began to emerge from the shell of fear she'd worn like armor. She started small. The 3rd week, Jacob came in to find she'd mended his shirts, the stitches so tiny and precise they were almost invisible. The 4th week, she asked if she could tend the garden plot behind the cabin. By the 5th week, she was working alongside him in the fields during the cooler morning hours, her hands learning the rhythm of planting and weeding. They didn't talk much during those early weeks. Maggie wasn't ready for questions, and Jacob didn't push. But in the shared silence of work, something began to grow between them. Trust, maybe. Or at least the beginning of it. The first time she laughed, it startled them both. Jacob had been trying to wrestle a stubborn fence post into the ground, cursing under his breath, when the whole thing collapsed and dumped him flat on his back in the mud. Maggie's laughter rang out clear and bright, and when Jacob looked over, she had her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with surprise at her own reaction. "Go ahead," Jacob said, grinning from his position in the mud. "I reckon I earned that." She laughed again, and this time she didn't try to stop it. The sound of it did something to Jacob's chest, made it feel too full and too tight all at once. But the peaceful moments were punctuated by reminders that danger still circled them. Twice more, riders came to the property while Jacob was working the far fields. Both times, Maggie hid in the root cellar as he'd taught her. Both times, the men left without finding her, but they took things with them. Tools from the barn, a bag of seed corn, once a whole side of dried venison from the smokehouse. "They're trying to starve us out," Maggie said after the second incident. They were sitting at the table, and she'd been quiet all evening, her face troubled. "Won't work," Jacob said. "We got enough put by, and the garden's coming in good. We'll make it through. But what about when they do more than steal? What about when they—" She stopped, wrapping her arms around herself. Jacob reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. "Maggie, look at me." She raised her eyes. "I won't let them take you. I promise you that. Whatever I got to do, however far I got to go, I won't let them hurt you again." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she nodded. And this time, when he moved his hand closer, she didn't pull away. Their fingers touched, just barely, and Jacob felt that small contact like a brand. The next Sunday, Jacob rode into town again, this time with a specific purpose. There was a woman who ran a boarding house on the edge of Hollowbrook, a widow named Mrs. Fong who'd come west with the railroad crews and stayed when her husband died. She had a reputation for being fair-minded and for having no patience for bullies. Jacob found her hanging laundry behind her house. She looked up as he approached, her weathered face unreadable. "Mrs. Fong," he said, tipping his hat. "I'm Jacob Brennan. I was hoping I could talk to you for a minute." "I know who you are," she said, pinning up a sheet. "You're the fool who bought Hayes' daughter at auction and made enemies of every powerful man in the county." "Yes, ma'am. That's about the size of it." She studied him for a long moment, then gestured to a bench beside her back door. "Sit. Talk." Jacob told her everything, about the auction, about Maggie hiding in the root cellar, about the threats and the stolen supplies. Mrs. Fong listened without interrupting, her hands never stopping their work. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. Then, "What do you want from me, Mr. Brennan? I want to know if there are others in this town who might stand with us when the time comes. Judge Morrison'll be back in 3 weeks. We just got to last until then." "And you think the judge will help you?" "I think the judge is an honest man who won't abide what Hayes did. But I need witnesses. People who'll testify to what really happened, to the kind of man Hayes is, to the arrangement he had with Morton." Mrs. Fong hung up the last sheet and turned to face him fully. "You're asking people to go against the sheriff and the richest man in town. That's dangerous, Mr. Brennan. I know it. But I also know there's got to be folks who are tired of watching Hayes and Morton run roughshod over everyone. People who'd speak up if they thought someone would listen." She was quiet again, and Jacob held his breath. Finally, she nodded. "There's a few. Patterson at the general store. He's got no love for Morton after what happened to his son. Sarah Whitmore, the schoolteacher, she tried to help Margaret after her mother died, but Hayes ran her off. And there's old Tom Begay, the Navajo trader who comes through. He's got no reason to fear Hayes and less to like him. Would they testify? Maybe. If they thought it would do any good. If they thought you and that girl might actually survive long enough to see a courtroom." She looked at him hard. 3 weeks is a long time, Mr. Brennan. A lot can happen." "I know it," Jacob said. "But we ain't got a choice. We got to try." Mrs. Fong nodded slowly. "I'll talk to them. Quiet like. See who might be willing. But you need to understand something." She leaned forward. "Morton owns half this town, and Hayes is the law. They're not going to let you embarrass them in front of a judge. They're going to come for that girl, and when they do, they'll come hard." "Let them come," Jacob said, and was surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "I've been running from fights my whole life, Mrs. Fong. I'm done running." She studied him for another long moment, then smiled slightly. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Brennan. I haven't decided which yet." "Probably a bit of both," Jacob admitted. "Fair enough. I'll send word if I hear anything. You watch yourself out there." Jacob rode home feeling lighter than he had in weeks. They weren't alone. There were people who would help, even if they had to do it quietly. It wasn't much, but it was something. When he reached the homestead, he found Maggie standing on the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She'd been watching for him, he realized, and something about that made his heart skip. "Everything all right?" she called as he dismounted. "Better than all right," he said, and told her about Mrs. Fong. Relief washed over Maggie's face. "So we'll have witnesses? People who'll tell the judge what really happened?" "If they're willing. Mrs. Fong's going to talk to them, feel them out." Jacob climbed the porch steps and leaned against the railing. "We got a chance now, Maggie. A real chance." She smiled, and Jacob realized it was the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, made her look young again instead of haunted. "I was starting to think maybe we should just run. Head to California, or up to Montana, somewhere they couldn't find us." "You want to run, we'll run," Jacob said. "I mean that. Your safety's more important than any piece of land." "No." Maggie shook her head firmly. "I'm tired of running. Tired of being scared. You stood up for me when nobody else would. The least I can do is stand with you now." Something passed between them in that moment, something Jacob couldn't quite name. He wanted to reach for her hand, to tell her that she'd come to mean more to him than just someone he'd helped. But the words stuck in his throat, and the moment passed. "Come on," he said instead. "Help me put the horse up, and then let's see what we can make for supper. I'm starved." They fell into a routine over the next week. Mornings were for work, fields and animals and the 100 small tasks that kept a homestead running. Afternoons, when the heat grew too fierce, they retreated to the cabin. Maggie would work on mending or reading from Jacob's small collection of books while he carved axe handles or repaired tack. Evenings they spent together at the table, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. Jacob learned things about her in those quiet hours. Learned that her mother had taught her to read when she was 4, that she loved poetry but was terrible at cooking, that she'd always wanted to see the ocean. She learned about him, too, about his childhood in Ohio, about the war and the things he'd done that still haunted him, about his dream of building something good and clean and honest out here on the frontier. "You think that's possible?" Maggie asked one evening. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of orange and red. "Building something good? After everything that's happened?" "I got to believe it is," Jacob said. "Otherwise, what's the point of any of it?" She was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to say that too. That even when things were darkest, you had to hold on to hope. That without hope, you were already dead." Her voice caught. She held on to it right up until the end. Even when the fever was burning her up, she kept saying everything would be all right. "I'm sorry," Jacob said quietly. "About your mother. About everything that happened after." "Papa changed when she died," Maggie said. "It was like something broke inside him. He started drinking, started gambling. I tried to hold things together, but I was just a girl. I didn't know how to stop him." She looked down at her hands. "The night before the auction, he came home drunk. Told me he'd sold me to settle his debts. Said Morton had agreed to pay everything he owed if Papa would sign the papers. He said I should be grateful, that Morton was a successful man who could give me a good life." Jacob's jaw clenched. "Maggie." "I told him no," she continued, her voice stronger now. "Told him I wouldn't do it, that he couldn't make me. He hit me. First time he'd ever raised a hand to me. And he said I didn't have a choice, that I was his property until I turned 21 and the law was on his side." She looked up at Jacob, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's when I knew my father was gone. The man who raised me, who taught me to read and to ride and to always do what was right, he was dead. And this stranger wearing his face had taken his place." Jacob reached over and took her hand. This time she didn't pull away. "You're free now," he said. "Whatever happens, you're never going back to that. I swear it on everything I hold sacred." She squeezed his hand. "I believe you," she whispered. "I don't know why, but I do." They sat there as darkness fell, hands clasped, both of them aware that something had shifted between them. What had started as a rescue, as one person helping another, was becoming something deeper. Something that scared Jacob even more than the threats from town. Because he'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to care about someone this much. And caring meant having something to lose. The attack came on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after Jacob's visit to Mrs. Fong. He was in the barn, forking hay down from the loft, when he heard the horses. Too many horses, moving too fast. Jacob dropped the pitchfork and grabbed his rifle, moving to the barn door. 5 riders were approaching the cabin. In the fading light, Jacob recognized Sheriff Hayes in the lead, Morton beside him. The other 3 were strangers, hard-looking men with guns on their hips. "Maggie!" Jacob shouted. "Get to the cellar! Now!" He saw her face appear in the cabin window, saw her eyes go wide with fear. Then she disappeared. Jacob stepped out of the barn, rifle in hand. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin. Hayes swayed slightly in his saddle, drunk even now. Morton's face was cold and calculating. "Brennan," Hayes called out, "this is official business. I'm here to retrieve my daughter." "You ain't got a daughter here," Jacob said. "Just me and my property." "Don't play games," Morton said. "We know she's here. We've been watching. Now you can hand her over peaceful, or we can do this the hard way." Jacob's finger found the trigger of his rifle. "There ain't no way you're taking her. Not while I'm breathing." One of the strangers laughed. "That can be arranged." "Hold on now," Hayes said, raising a hand. He focused his bloodshot eyes on Jacob with effort. "Brennan, you seem like a reasonable man. I don't want trouble. Just give me my daughter, and we'll forget this whole thing ever happened. No charges, no problems. You can go back to your farming in peace." "And what happens to Maggie?" Jacob asked. "That's family business. Not your concern." "It became my concern when you put her on an auction block like a slave," Jacob said, his voice hard. "You want her, Hayes. You're gonna have to come through me." Morton leaned forward in his saddle. "You're one man, Brennan. We're 5. You might get one of us, maybe 2 if you're lucky. But you'll be dead before you can reload, and then we'll take her anyway. This doesn't have to end with you in the ground. Be smart." Jacob's mind raced. Morton was right about the odds. In an open fight, Jacob would lose. But he'd known it might come to this. Had prepared for it. "You're right," Jacob said, lowering his rifle slightly. 5 against 1 ain't fair odds. He raised his voice. "Which is why I ain't alone." From the tree line to the north, 2 rifles cracked in quick succession. The shots went wide, warning shots, but the riders' horses reared and scattered. In the confusion, Jacob shouldered his rifle and aimed at Morton. "Next shots won't miss," Jacob called out. "Now you boys have a choice. You can ride out of here while you still can, or you can find out just how many friends I got hiding in those trees." He was bluffing. The shots had come from Tom Begay, the Navajo trader Mrs. Fong had mentioned. He'd ridden out 2 days ago to warn Jacob that trouble was coming, and Jacob had asked him to stay, to help even the odds if it came to a fight. But Morton and Hayes didn't know it was just one man. For all they knew, Jacob had a dozen rifles aimed at them. Hayes looked around nervously. One of the hired men was already backing his horse away. Morton's face had gone dark with rage, but even he could see the situation had changed. "This isn't over," Morton said. "Judge comes back next week. We'll settle this legal. Looking forward to it, Jacob said. Now get off my property before my friends get nervous with those triggers. The riders wheeled their horses and galloped away into the gathering darkness. Jacob stood there, rifle still raised, until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then his knees nearly buckled with relief. Tom Begay emerged from the trees, his rifle over his shoulder. He was a lean man in his 50s, with long gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "That was closer than I'd like," Tom said conversationally. "You and me both," Jacob said. "Thank you. I owe you for this." Tom shrugged. "Mrs. Fong said you were standing up to bullies. My people know something about bullies. Besides, Morton tried to cheat me on a trade last year. I got no love for that man." Maggie emerged from the cabin, shaking but trying to hide it. "Are they gone?" "For now," Jacob said. He gestured to Tom. "Maggie, this is Tom Begay. He's the reason we're all still standing." Maggie walked over and took Tom's hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "No need," Tom said. "Jacob tells me the judge comes back next week." "That true?" "That's what Mrs. Fong heard," Jacob confirmed. "We just got to last until then." "They'll come again," Tom said. "Probably with more men. You can't stay here." "I ain't leaving," Jacob said. "This is my land." "Then you need more than one old trader with a rifle." Tom looked at Maggie. "Mrs. Fong's been talking to folks. There's maybe 8-10 people who'd be willing to come out here, help defend this place until the judge returns. Good people who are tired of watching Morton and Hayes run things their way." Jacob felt something loosen in his chest. "They'd do that? Risk Morton's anger?" "They would if someone asked them. If someone made it clear this wasn't just about you and the girl. That it was about standing up to the kind of corruption that hurts everyone in the territory." Tom looked at him steadily. "You willing to make that ask?" Jacob looked at Maggie, saw the hope dawning in her eyes. Looked at his cabin, his barn, his fields. He'd come west to be alone, to avoid exactly this kind of trouble. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being alone. He'd found something worth fighting for. "Yeah," he said. "I'm willing." Tom nodded. "Then I'll ride back tonight, spread the word. Folks'll start arriving tomorrow, day after. We'll fort up here, take shifts watching. When Morton comes again, and he will, he'll find he's bitten off more than he can chew." "Tom," Maggie said quietly, "why are you doing this?" "You barely know us." The old trader smiled. "Girl, I've been watching white men's law for 40 years. Watched it take our land, break our treaties, push us onto reservations. But every now and then, I meet someone who remembers that law's supposed to protect folks, not crush them. Jacob here, he's one of those. And you," he looked at her kindly, "you've been hurt enough. Time someone stood up for you." Maggie's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Tom tipped his hat to them both. "See you tomorrow. Keep your rifles close and your eyes open. They might come back tonight." He rode away into the darkness, and Jacob and Maggie stood together in the yard, the night pressing close around them. "Do you really think people will come?" Maggie asked. "Tom says they will. I believe him." She turned to face him. "Jacob, if this goes wrong, if Morton kills you, or if the judge rules against us, I want you to know that these weeks here, they've been the first time I've felt safe since Mama died. The first time I've felt like maybe I could have a future. Whatever happens, you gave me that. You gave me hope." Jacob wanted to tell her that she'd given him something too. That somewhere between the auction yard and this moment, she'd stopped being just someone he'd helped and become someone he couldn't imagine living without. But the words were too big, too raw, and he was just a farmer who'd never been good with feelings. So instead, he took her hand and squeezed it gently. "We're gonna make it through this," he said. "Together. And when we do, when the judge rules in our favor and Morton backs down, we're gonna build something good here. A real home. A real life. If that's what you want." "Is that what you want?" she asked softly. Jacob looked at her, this brave, broken girl who was slowly becoming whole again, who laughed at his jokes and worked beside him in the fields and made his small cabin feel like home. And he realized that somewhere along the way, without meaning to, he'd fallen in love with her. "Yeah," he said simply. "That's what I want." She smiled then, a smile that lit up the darkness. "Then we'll fight for it," she said. "Whatever comes." They stood there together as the stars came out overhead, and Jacob Brennan, who'd spent years running from connection, from attachment, from anything that might make him vulnerable, finally understood what it meant to have something worth protecting. Not just land or property, but this fragile, fierce, impossible hope that two broken people might heal each other. The fight wasn't over. Morton would come again, and when he did, it would be worse. But standing there with Maggie's hand in his, Jacob wasn't afraid. Because he wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. They came at dawn the next morning, not with guns but with kindness. Mrs. Fong arrived first, driving a wagon loaded with supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, blankets. Behind her came Patterson from the general store, looking nervous but determined. Then Sarah Whitmore, the schoolteacher, a thin woman with steel in her eyes. By noon, there were 12 people gathered at Jacob's homestead, and more were expected. Tom Begay organized them with the efficiency of a military commander. He posted sentries at the tree line, established a rotation for watch duty, and helped Jacob reinforce the cabin and barn. The men dug rifle pits at strategic points around the property while the women worked inside, preparing food and organizing medical supplies. Maggie moved among them, quiet but present. Jacob watched her help Mrs. Fong sort through bandages, saw her talking softly with Sarah Whitmore. The schoolteacher had tears in her eyes as they spoke, and she pulled Maggie into a fierce embrace. "I tried to help you," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the yard. "After your mother passed. I went to your father, told him you needed support, needed someone. He ran me off his property with a shotgun." "It wasn't your fault," Maggie said. "He was already gone by then. Already lost." Jacob turned back to his work, driving posts into the ground for a barricade. Patterson worked beside him, sweating in the autumn heat. "I don't mind telling you I'm scared," Patterson admitted. "Morton's got a long memory. When this is over, assuming we survive it, he'll make life hard for anyone who stood against him." "You don't have to stay," Jacob said. "No one's asking you to risk everything." Patterson shook his head. "My boy was sweet on Margaret, back before Hayes started his decline. Used to walk her home from church sometimes. When Morton tried to force my boy into working off a debt I didn't owe, tried to make him a slave in everything but name, Margaret's mother stood up for us. Went to the territorial governor herself, got the debt dismissed. Said no man should be able to own another through legal tricks. He drove his post harder. I owe her family. And I ain't letting Morton do to that girl what he tried to do to my son." By evening, the homestead looked like a small fort. Barricades ringed the main buildings, firing positions covered all approaches, and enough supplies were stocked to last a siege of weeks if necessary. Jacob stood on his porch, looking at what his small property had become, feeling both grateful and guilty. "They came for me," Mrs. Fong said, joining him. "All of them. They came because they're tired of being afraid. You just gave them a reason to stand together." "I didn't ask for this," Jacob said quietly. "No. But sometimes we don't get to choose our battles. Sometimes they choose us." She looked at him appraisingly. "You love her, don't you?" The girl. Jacob didn't answer immediately. Then, yeah, I do. Does she know? I don't know. Probably not. Ain't exactly the right time for confessions. Mrs. Fong smiled slightly. There's never a right time. There's just time. Don't waste it. That night, the community gathered around a large fire in Jacob's yard. Someone had brought a fiddle, and for a while they sang old songs and told stories, trying to pretend this was just a social gathering and not the calm before a storm. Children ran between the wagons, laughing, and Jacob found himself thinking about what it would be like to have children here. His and Maggie's. A family built from ashes. Maggie sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. She'd been quiet all day, and Jacob could see the weight of guilt on her face. "You're thinking this is your fault," he said softly. She looked at him, startled. "How did you? I know that look. I've worn it myself often enough." He shifted to face her. "Maggie, listen to me. This ain't about you being a burden or causing trouble. This is about good people standing up to bad ones. That's all it is. And every person here chose to come. They ain't here because they have to be. They're here because it's right. But if I'd just gone with Morton at the auction, then you'd be suffering right now, and nothing would change. Hayes would still be corrupt. Morton would still be a tyrant. The only difference is you'd be trapped and hurting, and I'd be a coward who walked away when someone needed help." He took her hand. "I'm glad you're here, Maggie. Whatever comes of this, I'm glad." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that as the fire burned down and the stars wheeled overhead. Around them, the community settled in for the night, posting guards and checking weapons. Tomorrow the judge would return to Hollowbrook. Tomorrow they would ride into town and demand a hearing. But tonight they had this moment of peace. Jacob didn't sleep. He walked the perimeter, checking on the sentries, making sure everyone was positioned well. Tom Begay joined him on his rounds, moving silent as a shadow. "You ready for tomorrow?" Tom asked. "No, but I'll do it anyway." "Good answer." Tom was quiet for a moment. "You know Morton won't let this go to a hearing. He'll try to stop you before you reach town." "I know it. So we'll be ready. Half our people will ride with you to town. The other half stays here to protect the homestead and the children. If Morton's smart, he'll ambush you on the road. If he's stupid, he'll attack here while you're gone. And if he's truly vicious," Jacob said, "he'll do both." Tom nodded. "Then we'd better be smarter than him." They walked in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Finally, Tom spoke again. "You asked me yesterday why I'm helping. I told you it was about standing up to bullies. That's true, but it ain't the whole truth." He looked at Jacob. 40 years ago, I watched white men take my sister in a raid. She was 15. They said it was legal, said she'd signed a contract to work off a debt. But she couldn't read, couldn't write her own name. They took her anyway, and we never saw her again. His voice was steady, but Jacob could hear the old pain beneath it. "I couldn't save her. But maybe I can save this one." Jacob didn't know what to say to that. Sometimes there were no words big enough for that kind of grief. So he just nodded, and they finished their rounds together in silence. Dawn came cold and clear. Autumn was sliding toward winter, and frost sparkled on the grass. Jacob saddled his horse while around him, the community prepared for the day ahead. 6 riders would accompany him and Maggie to town. Tom, Patterson, Sarah Whitmore, and 3 others. Mrs. Fong would stay behind with the remaining defenders to hold the homestead. Maggie emerged from the cabin wearing a dress Sarah had brought, her hair pinned up and her face pale but determined. She looked older somehow, and stronger. Jacob helped her onto her horse, aware of everyone watching. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I can testify to what happened. You can stay here where it's safe." "No," Maggie said firmly. "I'm done hiding. I'm done being afraid. This is my fight too." Jacob nodded and mounted his own horse. The small group formed up, checking rifles and pistols one last time. Mrs. Fong came to stand beside Jacob's stirrup. "You be careful," she said. "And if things go wrong, if Morton's waiting with an army, you run. You hear me? The fight ain't worth dying for." "Yes, ma'am," Jacob said, though they both knew he was lying. They rode out as the sun cleared the hills, 8 riders moving at a steady pace toward Hollowbrook. The prairie stretched out around them, beautiful and indifferent. Jacob kept his hand near his rifle, his eyes scanning the landscape for threats. They'd covered maybe half the distance to town when Tom raised a hand, bringing them to a halt. "Riders ahead," he said quietly. "Maybe a dozen. Spread out across the road." Jacob's stomach tightened. Morton had chosen the ambush after all. "Everyone stay calm," he said. "Let me do the talking." They rode forward slowly. As they got closer, Jacob could make out the waiting men. Morton sat in the center on a large black horse, flanked by Sheriff Hayes and 10 others. All of them were armed. The two groups faced each other across 50 yards of prairie grass. Jacob rode forward alone, stopping halfway between them. "Morton," he called out, "we're on our way to see Judge Morrison. You got no cause to stop us." "I got every cause," Morton called back. "That's stolen property you're transporting. And these people with you are aiding a criminal act." "The only criminals here are you and Hayes," Jacob said. "But we'll let the judge decide that. Now move aside." Morton smiled, and it was the coldest thing Jacob had ever seen. The judge had an unfortunate accident on his way back from Santa Fe. Broke his leg, be laid up for months. Which means I'm still the law in this territory. And I say you're all under arrest. Jacob's heart sank, but he kept his face neutral. "On what charge?" "Theft, kidnapping, obstruction of justice. Take your pick." Morton gestured to his men. "Now you can come peaceful, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Behind Jacob, he heard someone cock a rifle. Tom's voice carried clearly. "Seems to me you're outnumbered, Morton. There's 8 of us, and you think you got 12. But I count at least 4 more rifles in those rocks behind you, and probably 6 more in the grass to your left. So maybe you want to think real careful about your next move." Jacob blinked. Tom was bluffing again. Had to be. But Morton's men were looking around nervously now, and Jacob realized that Tom had positioned their group perfectly, with the morning sun at their backs, making it hard for Morton's men to see clearly, and near enough to rocky outcroppings that it was plausible reinforcements could be hiding there. Morton's face darkened. "You're bluffing, old man." "Maybe," Tom said calmly. "But you willing to bet your life on it? Because I promise you, even if you kill all 8 of us, you and your boys won't walk away from this. My people are watching. They know what you're trying to do. And they will come for you." The standoff stretched out, tension crackling in the air. Jacob's hand stayed near his pistol, ready for whatever came next. Then, from behind Morton's line, a new voice called out. "That's enough." Everyone turned. A rider was approaching from town, moving fast. As he got closer, Jacob recognized him. Deputy Marshal Carson, a federal lawman who occasionally passed through the territory. He rode straight into the middle of the standoff, his badge glinting in the sunlight. "What in blazes is going on here?" Carson demanded. Morton recovered quickly. "Marshal, these people are wanted for—" "For what?" Carson interrupted. "I've been in Hollowbrook for 2 days now, waiting for Judge Morrison. Heard some interesting stories about you, Morton. About sheriffs selling their daughters to settle gambling debts. About auctions that shouldn't have been legal. He looked at Jacob. "You Brennan?" "Yes, sir." "And this is Margaret Hayes?" Carson gestured to Maggie. "It is." Carson looked at Morton and Hayes. "Then I'd say we need to have a proper hearing about this. Federal level, since it seems local law enforcement is compromised. Judge Morrison will be back in a month, once his leg heals. Until then, I'm placing Miss Hayes under federal protection. Anyone who touches her answers to me and the United States government. We clear." Morton's face had gone purple with rage, but he couldn't argue with a federal marshal. "This ain't over, Carson." "Actually, it is," Carson said. "I've been reviewing the auction documents. They're fraudulent. Hayes didn't have legal authority to sell his daughter. No one does, because people ain't property in this territory. The whole thing's invalid. Which means Miss Hayes is free to go where she pleases, and anyone who says different is breaking federal law." Jacob felt dizzy with relief. Beside him, Maggie made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sob. "Furthermore," Carson continued, "I'm suspending Sheriff Hayes pending an investigation into corruption and abuse of authority. Hayes, you're going to come with me back to town, and we're going to have a long talk about your gambling debts and your arrangements with Mr. Morton." Hayes swayed in his saddle, his face gray. For a moment, Jacob almost felt sorry for him. Then he remembered Maggie's bruises, her terror, and the feeling passed. Morton wheeled his horse around. "This ain't finished," he snarled at Jacob. "You made an enemy today." "I made an enemy the day I stopped you from hurting an innocent girl," Jacob said. "And I'd do it again without hesitation." Morton rode off with most of his men. Hayes, broken and drunk, allowed Carson to lead him back toward town. The marshal paused beside Jacob's group. "You folks want to follow me back to town? We can make this official, get statements, start the paperwork to make sure Miss Hayes is protected going forward." "We'd appreciate that, Marshal," Jacob said. They rode into Hollowbrook together, 8 survivors and 1 federal lawman. As they passed through the streets, people came out to watch. Jacob saw shock on some faces, satisfaction on others. By evening, everyone in the territory would know that Morton had been faced down and Hayes had been arrested. The hearing took place in the town hall, with Carson presiding. One by one, people testified. Patterson talked about Morton's attempts to enslave his son through debt manipulation. Sarah Whitmore described Hayes' descent into alcoholism and abuse. Mrs. Fong presented letters she'd collected from other victims of Morton's schemes. Tom Begay spoke about the forged auction documents and the illegal nature of the sale. And finally, Maggie testified. She stood before the room, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger. She told them everything, about her mother's death, her father's betrayal, the night he sold her to Morton. About the terror of the auction block and Jacob's intervention. About the weeks of healing at his homestead and the threats from Morton and Hayes. When she finished, there were tears on several faces. Even Carson looked moved. "Miss Hayes," the marshal said formally, "I hereby declare you a free and independent woman, not subject to any claims of debt or property. The auction was illegal and null. You are free to go wherever you wish and to make your own choices about your future." Maggie's knees buckled, and Jacob was there to catch her. She turned into his chest and wept, great shaking sobs of relief and release. He held her while the room slowly emptied, while Carson finished his paperwork, while the sun set outside the windows. Finally, she pulled back and looked up at him. "It's really over?" she whispered. "It's really over," he confirmed. "And I can stay? At the homestead? If I want to." Jacob's heart hammered. "You can stay as long as you like. Forever, if that's what you want." "Forever," she repeated, testing the word. Then she smiled. "I think I'd like that." They rode back to the homestead as stars appeared overhead. The community had stayed through the day, and when Jacob and Maggie returned, they were greeted with cheers and embraces. Someone had prepared a feast, and the celebration stretched late into the night. Jacob found himself standing apart from the crowd, watching Maggie laugh with Sarah Whitmore and Mrs. Fong. She looked lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Tom came to stand beside him. "You did good," the old trader said. "We all did," Jacob corrected. "Couldn't have done it without you, without all of them." "Maybe so. But you're the one who started it. You're the one who saw a girl being sold like property and said no." Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "That takes courage. And heart. Don't forget that." The community began to disperse over the next few days. Patterson returned to his store. Sarah went back to her school. Mrs. Fong to her boarding house. Each of them stopped to say goodbye to Jacob and Maggie, to promise they'd visit, to remind them they weren't alone anymore. Tom was the last to leave. He stood by his horse, preparing to head out on his trading route. "You take care of her," he said to Jacob. "And you," he said to Maggie, "you take care of him right back. He's got good instincts but terrible cooking skills." Maggie laughed. "I'll do my best." Tom rode away, and then they were alone again. Jacob and Maggie stood in the yard of the homestead, watching the dust settle behind the old trader's departure. "So," Maggie said, "what do we do now?" Jacob looked around at his property, the cabin, the barn, the fields ready for winter planting. Everything he'd built alone, that now felt incomplete without her in it. "Now," he said, "now we finish that barn before the snow comes. Plant winter wheat. Fix the fence on the South 40. Normal things. Boring things." "Sounds perfect," Maggie said. They walked toward the cabin together. At the door, Jacob paused. "Maggie, about what I said earlier. About you staying forever. I meant it. But I want to be clear about what I'm offering. It ain't just a place to live. It's—" He stopped, searching for words. "I care about you. More than I probably should, given everything. And if you wanted, if you were willing, I'd like to court you proper. Build a life together, not just share a homestead. Get married, maybe, if you'd have me." Maggie looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. Then she smiled, soft and genuine. "Jacob Brennan," she said, "you saved my life in that auction yard. But more than that, you gave me back myself. You made me feel human again when I thought I'd lost that forever. So yes, I'd like that very much. All of it." Jacob felt something unlock in his chest, something he'd kept guarded for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Hope. Real, genuine hope for a future that didn't involve running or hiding or being alone. He took her hand, and they stood together on the threshold of the cabin, looking out at the prairie as the sun set in shades of gold and crimson. Winter was coming, but they were ready for it. Together. And somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the world kept turning. Morton would lick his wounds and plot revenge that would never come. Hayes would drink himself into obscurity in some distant town. The territory would keep growing, keep changing, keep becoming something new. But here, on this small homestead in the middle of the endless prairie, two people who'd been broken by life were slowly healing each other, building something good and clean and honest from the ruins of their pasts. Jacob pulled Maggie close, and she came willingly, resting her head against his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me when everyone else looked away. For standing when everyone else walked past. For being the kind of man who'd risk everything for a stranger." "You ain't a stranger anymore," Jacob said softly. "You're home." And in that moment, standing together as the stars came out overhead and the prairie wind whispered around them, that simple truth felt like the most important thing in the world. They were home. Both of them. Finally. The winter would be hard, as winters always were on the frontier. There would be challenges ahead, struggles and setbacks and moments when survival itself felt uncertain. But they would face it together, this cowboy and the sheriff's daughter he'd rescued from an auction block. Two broken people made whole by courage and kindness and the stubborn refusal to let evil win. And that, Jacob thought as he led Maggie inside and closed the door against the gathering darkness, was all any of them could hope for. A chance to start again. A chance to build something better. A chance to prove that even in the hardest places, even in the darkest times, love and justice could still prevail. They had that chance now. And Jacob Brennan, who'd spent so long running from his past, was finally ready to build a future. With Maggie by his side, anything seemed possible.